get started in the interest of time. Welcome, my name is Rajdeep Singh. I serve as Policy Director for the Sikh Coalition, which is the nation's largest Sikh American advocacy organization. We're very proud to be here today to present a briefing on barriers to religious liberty for Sikh Americans who wish to serve in the U.S. military. We're going to be hearing from a very distinguished group of panelists. But before I introduce them, I want to share an anecdote to ground us in some context. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I was into baseball cards when I was a kid. And when I was 9 years old, I remember on one occasion going to a baseball card store and walking up to the man who ran the store and asking to look at some baseball cards, and he saw me. He was kind of an elderly gentleman, and he said, "You're a Sikh, aren't you?" I said, "Sure." And I remember, I was a kid, I was about 9 or 10 years old. He says, "You know what? I served with Sikh soldiers in Burma during World War II. Your people are great fighters. Your people are great soldiers. So I just want to recognize everything that your community has done for the Allies during the World Wars." As you can imagine, this was an inspiration for me and a wonderful bit of feedback to hear. But later in life, I was disappointed to learn, as many of us in the Sikh community were also disappointed to learn, that Sikh Americans are presumptively prohibited from serving in the U.S. Armed Forces on account of their religion. So that's the context of this discussion today. And what I'd like to do before I introduce the panelists is sort of walk you through some of the materials that you may have on your chairs and which are available outside. Underneath our cover page, you will find a Dear Colleague letter, which is circulating in the House as we speak. This Dear Colleague letter, in general terms, expresses support for religious liberty for Sikh Americans who wish to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And before I introduce the panelists, I want to ask whether we've got representatives here from the offices who are sponsoring this letter, namely the offices of Congressman David Valadao, Congressman Joseph Crowley, Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen, and Congresswoman Judy Chu. I see Jessica here, I see Jeremy here. Is Steve here? Is anyone from Amit from Congresswoman Chu's office? Well, we've got representatives here from these offices who are sponsoring this letter. So if at any point during this presentation you have questions about the letter or after this presentation, please be in touch with these folks. We'd love to have your offices endorse this letter after this briefing. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists very quickly. And by the way, there are people in the back. I invite you to take some seats up front here. I want to introduce our panelists, and then we'll begin very quickly. Amandeep Sindhu is a partner at the law firm McDermott, Will, and Emery. It's a major international law firm. He focuses on complex commercial litigation. He also has the distinction of being a co-founder of the Sikh Coalition and has been recognized for his work, his pro bono work in support of religious liberty for the Sikh community in the last several years after the formation of the Sikh Coalition. He's been instrumental, his firm's been instrumental in helping move our campaign forward with respect to Sikhs in the U.S. Armed Forces. To his right, we have Major Kamaljeet Singh Kalsi. Major Kamaljeet Singh Kalsi is a veteran of our nation's war in Afghanistan. He is a physician, he's a medical doctor, but he's also a proud American soldier. He made history in 2009 by receiving a very rare individualized waiver to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces with his articles of faith intact. And he's very modest about this, but he came back from Afghanistan with a Bronze Star Medal for his service in our nation's military. And then finally, we have Daniel Blomberg. Daniel Blomberg is legal counsel for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. The Becket Fund, if any of you are not aware, is one of the premier law firms devoted to protecting and vindicating religious liberty in the United States. They've successfully litigated a number of cases implicating religious liberty in the federal courts and also in the U.S. Supreme Court. Daniel, I believe, clerked for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, so he is a very sort of distinguished lawyer and litigator. So with that, I am happy to begin our briefing.
Just echoing on what Rajdeep just mentioned, thank you all so much for being here today. I know you have busy schedules and catching up after the holidays, and we were really excited to be on the Hill today. The information we're covering is the type of information we've been covering with individual offices, but to have the opportunity to not only speak to this group, but have Major Kalsi here with us, as well as Daniel from the Becket Fund, is really a unique opportunity, so we're glad you're here. In case it's not obvious from the intro from Rajdeep, I wanted to just cover sort of Sikhism 101. The uncut hair and turban are required religious articles of faith. So Sikh men, as a result of the requirement that we not cut our hair, also have uncut facial hair. And then an extension of that obligation, an extension of that uniform is the wearing of the turban. As Rajdeep framed, the current policy of the Department of Defense and each of the branches in our U.S. Armed Forces is one that presumptively excludes members of the Sikh faith as well as other religious minorities where they have obvious articles of faith that conflict with military-issued headwear or other uniform requirements, and then a tacit ban on facial hair. And I'll get into some of the rationales and concerns that appear to drive those two policies. But what I wanted to do initially is just give you a sense of the deep and rich military history of Sikhs serving both around the world as well as here in the United States. Sikhs have served, as you can imagine, in the Indian Armed Forces, where the Sikh community originates, and are an integral part of that armed forces. The current chief of the Indian Army is a Sikh and wears a turban, keeps a beard. In the United Kingdom and the forces of the UK, in the Canadian forces, and as UN peacekeepers. There are also a spattering of Sikh soldiers and other armed forces around the world. But more importantly, Sikhs have a long history of serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, in particular in the U.S. Army. As early as World War I, Becket Singh Kalsi emigrated to the United States and chose to serve his country. Considered his home to be the United States, not India, and wanted to give back and sought to serve and was able to serve in the U.S. Army. And so from that point in the early part of the last century up until the early 80s, Sikhs served with distinction and without any concerns or issues with regard to their articles of faith. They were able to wear turbans, they were able to keep beards, and there were no military policies that excluded them from serving. In the early 1980s, there was a shift in that policy. DoD moved towards a framework that did not permit facial hair, period, and also did not allow for religious headwear to the extent that it conflicted with military-issued headwear. So to the extent that headwear could be concealed underneath a beret, concealed underneath a helmet, that continued to be permissible, but the turban was considered to be excluded from that framework. So mid-1980s forward, several dozen Sikhs were serving at the time of that policy change. They continued to serve. And so you had individuals who were grandfathered in, two of which, before they retired in 2009, had reached the rank of colonel. So you have Colonel Seko on the left and Colonel G.B. Singh on the right. Ironically, a physician and a dentist. And the reason that's important is at the time that they were retiring in 2009, the Sikh Coalition was approached by Major Kalsi and another individual, Captain Kamaljeet Singh. Major Kalsi is a physician, Captain Ratan is a dentist. Both of these individuals were recruited into the U.S. Army's Health Professions Scholarship Program. They were in medical school and dental school respectively. They were recruited by the U.S. Army to join that scholarship program, whereby the U.S. Army would pay for their medical training in exchange for their service to our country, sort of the medical school equivalent of ROTC. And based on their recruitment, based on assurances that their religious practices would not be an issue, largely informed by the fact that you had two colonels in the U.S. Army, Colonel Seko and Colonel Singh. They spent several years as reserve officers in the U.S. Army. They did training and rotations on U.S. Army bases. And it was only at the time when they were completing their medical training and the discussions began about their active duty station that someone started to read between the lines and realized that the current framework, the current DoD directives, the current Army regulations, again, prohibited facial hair on its face and prohibited religious headwear to the extent that it conflicted with military-issued headwear. So that brought Major Kalsi and Captain Ratan to the Sikh Coalition, a leading civil rights organization in the United States. The Sikh Coalition had a partnership with McDermott, Will, and Emery. We decided that the time was right to challenge this issue. I was born and raised in Virginia. I can tell you that the single issue of importance that resonates with everyone in the Sikh American community is the current door that is closed to serving our country. Whether you were born here, whether you came here, Sikh Americans want to give back. They want to have that opportunity. And so we felt that the circumstances were right, both from the standpoint of having very strong clients who we knew would do very well under the rigors of being officers in the U.S. Army. And we had the resources and a community that was ready to come behind our efforts and make this happen. So in 2009, we launched a very public campaign to seek the religious accommodation of then Captain Kalsi, now Major Kalsi, and Captain Ratan. And based on those efforts, we had fairly significant congressional support, 43 members of Congress, 6 senators writing letters to then Secretary Gates on behalf of our efforts. We had a long and protracted dialogue with DoD and with Army representatives, and ultimately our advocacy efforts combined with media coverage of our efforts led to what was, as was described by Rajdeep, very extraordinary exceptions to policy, very individualized, singular exemptions that applied only to these individuals, not to the community broadly. They were very limited in scope in terms of their immediate prospective assignments. And so as a result of that extraordinary effort, and I say extraordinary, literally dozens of members of a dozen members of the Sikh Coalition staff, 10 attorneys at McDermott, Will, and Emery, $500,000 worth of pro bono legal services, and countless hours of community outreach to congressional offices and to the like. It resulted in those accommodations. So not the type of resources the average young Sikh American has back in his community, wanting to go to his local recruiting office and join the U.S. Army. So where we are today is that in 2009 we were somewhat untested. While Sikhs had served, again, through all of the major armed conflicts, we had very senior ranking officers in the U.S. Army who were practicing Sikhs. The issue in terms of new Sikh recruits was untested. We assumed that there were certain concerns, but we didn't know that those were the concerns. We sit here today, 4 years later, with proof positive that all of those concerns have been debunked. And I'll walk through each of those to help you understand the perspective that we've taken. One is the concept of uniformity. Just generally speaking, the idea that our armed forces are driven by, and the success and the sanctity of our effectiveness as the most effective armed forces in the world is the fact that there is a level of uniformity. The idea that each of us are equal, in terms of the high and tight haircut, in terms of the clean-shaven look. I think the reality there is that obviously the diversity that exists in our armed forces now does not bring absolute similarity, whether it's based on race, whether it's based on gender. The diversity of our country is gradually becoming more and more reflected in our armed forces. And so to be a Sikh, to be a member of the Sikh faith is to have a uniform. We aren't allowed to keep our hair open in dreadlocks. We aren't allowed to keep ourselves diskept. Our actual religious tenets are that you must be neat and conservative, directly in line with the Army's protocol and their requirements. So for purposes of Sikhs seeking to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, you'll notice that the Sikh men in this room, the three up here, myself included, a few others in the room, our beards look to be shaved or trimmed or kept close to our faces. My beard is actually down to the middle of my chest. It's tied with gel, it's hairsprayed, it's pressed, and it's kept neat and conservative. That's how a gas mask works. That's how you're able to establish a seal. We're not asking for an extraordinary scenario where a Sikh who seeks to perhaps keep his beard open would be able to meet that neat and conservative standard. We've also been able to establish a framework based largely on what we've seen around the world, that just as you would wear a certain type of beret or a certain type of hat with a certain type of uniform, you wear a certain type of turban. So when you join the army as a Sikh in India or in the UK or in Canada, you're issued military issued turbans that go with your uniform. You see Major Kalsi wearing the camo turban that matches his field uniform. When he's in his dress uniform, he's wearing a black or a dark navy blue turban. We, just to jump from Major Kalsi and Captain Ratan in 2010, we had the opportunity to represent now Corporal Lumba. And as an enlisted soldier, we knew that he had unique challenges that were different from those of officers. And so, for example, he was required to, as a non-Sikh, would have worn a beret with a certain flash on the front of his turban that he would remove out of respect when he went into the mess hall or into a building or met another officer in the hall. And so he fashioned an emblem that would attach to the front of his turban with Velcro so that it would be removed out of respect. So ways in which we've tried to establish a framework that allows the Army to maintain the safety, uniformity, and security concerns. As I mentioned, the gas mask, it fits. Our clients, Major Kalsi will tell you, and Captain Ratan, in his experience, they sat in the gas chamber longer than anyone else during basic training. The helmet, a small under turban, can be worn like a bandana that's worn in the field and allows the helmet to be worn. And then ultimately, sort of the broader issues of how is this impacting unit cohesion, how does it impact esprit de corps. Major Kalsi will tell you his experience is, again, proof positive that there is a soldier serving next to a soldier, or brother next to a brother, or brother next to a sister. When he's out there saving lives, when Captain Ratan was out there mitigating a conflict in Afghanistan to avoid disruptions that resulted in him getting a NATO accommodation, it was a soldier serving our country. And then finally, the idea that there is some slippery slope. The idea that if we allow Sikhs to return to serving, that somehow the floodgates open to fringe religious organizations, other organized entities that seek to make a mockery of our armed forces. And the reality is, as I hope I've made clear, is that the framework and the pivot is always back to uniformity, neat and conservative, safety and security. Can you meet all of those standards? Can you meet a neat and conservative look? Can you meet the safety concerns? And can you do it in a way that is respectful of our current U.S. Armed Forces policies? And we believe that we have done that. So finally, our ask. We're asking you to go back to your members and seek their support for a letter that very respectfully asks the Secretary of Defense that to finally make formal and permanent a policy that currently is ad hoc and imprecise. And our clients have been fortunate to have extraordinary resources that they could avail. Not every Sikh American can do that. And so for the 3 clients we've gotten individual accommodations for, there are several dozen who we either couldn't represent or they had gone about it themselves and they were rejected at the door. That can't be the case in this country. And so with the very clear directive from our Army that diversity is a strategic imperative for the success of our armed forces, we have to consider that the time is right for Sikhs to have an open door to be able to serve. Not an unrestrained open path, but a door that's open that allows a Sikh American to go and prove himself in basic training, and either he makes it or he doesn't. Can he meet the standard or doesn't? But to go to the door and be turned away simply can't be the case. And so we appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to Major Kalsi.
Thank you. Thank you, Emery. That was a wonderful intro. Is it okay if I stand? Yeah. Camera crew. All right. You can see everybody's faces a little better this way. So, how did we get here today? Back in 2001, I was in medical school, and the recruiters came and they said, do you want to join the military? And more specifically, do you want to join the Army? So I said, yeah, love to. You know, I come from 4 generations of military service. My father and my grandfather were both in the Indian Air Force, and my great-grandfather was in the Royal British Army. So I said, I would love to serve. And I said, but I serve like this. My turban, my beard, and if you're okay with that, you know, I'm ready to bleed for you. And they said, yep, we've got Sikhs in the Army, you know, Army places a high value on religious liberty. So that's great. So began our journey. So that was 2001. In fact, notably, that was 7 months before 9/11, before sort of the landscape changed. So through the years, now I've been in the military for 13 years now. I've been on active duty a number of times. I've served at Travis Air Force Base in California, West Point in New York, and it had never been a problem. This is through medical school and training. Then, after residency, when it was time to go from the reserves and occasional active duty to full-time active duty, I called my leadership and I said, hey guys, it's been 7 years, hasn't been a problem so far, but just so you know, I have a turban and beard, and just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And same response at that time. They said, yeah, no problem, don't worry about it. We value your religion. And I felt really good about that. So I get a call about a month and a half later. I was captain at the time. Actually, Captain Kalsi, we looked into the regs a little more closely, and this is going to be a bit of a problem. But we value your religion and your right to practice. So we are going to give you a letter of support, and we'll take this up the chain of command. And we started to do that. And from one step to the next, it took us more than a year and a half. And not just me alone. That was our friends over at the Sikh Coalition, our friends at McDermott, Will, and Emery. It took hundreds, if not thousands of hours from several organizations to get one guy in. And then, you know, obviously we had Captain Ratan and then Corporal Lamba follow after us. But it is too much effort to get the 3 of us in. And while our armed forces currently will say, yeah, we don't bar Sikhs from coming, functionally, it is a barrier to service. Functionally, I know that my Sikh brothers and sisters, you know, living down the street that can't afford $500,000, that can't afford, you know, to go around and lobby the halls of Congress and get 43 congressmen, get support from 15,000 petitioners. Functionally, the doors are closed to them. So, after I got my accommodation back in 2009, my subspecialty training, I'm an ER doc, is in disaster medicine. So I went to Israel, wonderful country. I went to Israel for my disaster training, and I saw that a number of the soldiers there wore gas masks, but they had beards. So I said, how do you guys do it? This is such a big deal in the United States. They said, well, we just put it on. I said, it can't be that easy. They're like, no, really, try it. It's that simple. So as soon as I got home, came back to the States, I bought myself a standard issue Army gas mask, and I played with it. I put it on, and true enough, you know, when I'm wearing my little sports turban, my little bandana, I get a good seal. And so we, tested it out several times. I went to boot camp. Army didn't just take my word for it. They threw me in the gas chamber several times, and they said, yeah, you're right, you do get a good seal. That's what I've been telling you all along. And so they did the same to Captain Ruthven and to Corporal Lamba. And they said, yeah, you guys can make a seal, you can wear the helmet. And my first day at boot camp, I'll never forget this. The sergeant major stood me out in front of the formation, and in front of hundreds of soldiers, sort of the first day I had met everyone. Said, does anyone have a problem with Major Kalsi wearing his turban and beard? If anyone has a problem, let me tell you that the Army comes in many shades of green. Speak now. Nobody had an issue. In fact, everyone there applauded in support. So that boot camp started, and then we did, went through all the obstacles. Did the ruck, did the navigation, did the shooting, did everything a normal soldier would do. And it's like Aman said, it wasn't a blank check. I had to do everything a regular soldier had to do. If I couldn't get the seal on the gas mask, or if I couldn't do the ruck, if I couldn't do the day-night land navigation, I wouldn't be here today, right? So that's all Sikhs are asking for. They're not asking for a blank check. They're asking for the ability, the opportunity to be able to go to boot camp. Right now, my little brother or my little son, they can't even step into the recruiter's office. So that's what we're asking for. Now, when we deployed to Afghanistan, this is back in 2000, 2010, 2011, it was a far forward setting. I was the chief of the ER, actually the only expeditionary hospital and theater. When I got there, I learned that expeditionary is really just a sexy term for tent. They didn't tell me that before I left. But we were in Helmand Province, and if you guys know anything about Helmand Province, it was one of the bloodiest zones in theater. So we were busy. We took care of thousands of casualties. And when I saw the first day we landed, when I saw my fellow soldiers, my brothers and sisters in arms bleeding, I went to them and I took care of them. One of them, let's call him Joe. He was a Marine, badly wounded by an IED. Came in, had multiple cuts, he had blast injuries. We worked on him for a few hours. We took care of him. And Joe was one of the lucky ones. He made it. So just before we had him shipped out, he sort of grabbed my hand and he said, thanks, brother. And that meant a lot to me. It was my first day there, and I'll never forget that moment. But this is what we're talking about, right? If you can do the job, if you can help the mission, if you're an asset, that's what matters. And I think we've proven that, right? Between myself, Captain Ruthven, Corporal Lamba, we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are, in fact, assets. And as Aman mentioned, diversity is a strategic imperative, right? We didn't allow African Americans and women and other minorities into the military because it was the right thing to do. Sure, we did that because it was the right thing to do. We did it because we needed to do it. We needed to win the war. We knew that if we didn't do it, we wouldn't be as strong of a military. So while we talk about diversity and inclusion, we also talk about religious liberty. One of the founding things founding aspects of our nation, right? Some of the first settlers to the United States came here looking for religious liberties. When we go to a far forward setting, when I'm there as a doctor taking care of wounded soldiers, you know who's right next to me? Is a chaplain. Is a military chaplain. It might be Army, maybe Navy, Marine, or Air Force. There's a chaplain. And if the Army did not feel that religion is important, why would a chaplain be standing next to me in a far forward field setting? All right, so I love the Army. I love the military. It's become a big part of me and a part of my life. And Sikhs everywhere are very patriotic. We just want the ability to be able to serve our nation, the ability for our kids to say that we can do anything, and make the connections that'll, in the future, hopefully avoid the disasters that we saw in Oak Creek, all the hate crimes, all the bullying and job discrimination that we've seen over the years. We just want to sort of become part of the community without having to give up what is our religious uniform. So that's all. Thank you.
My name is Daniel Blomberg, and I'm not going to be nearly as good as that. I'm a lawyer with the Becket Fund, which means I like to talk a lot, but I'm going to do my best to keep this at 10 minutes. And what my purpose is to talk about three different things. First, I'm going to talk about the history of military religious liberty. Second, I'm going to talk about why the military prizes religious liberty as much as it has. And third, I'm going to talk about the existing laws that protect military religious liberty, and particularly one of them, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and how that would apply to a situation like the Major's case, and why it should protect his ability to serve his country and serve his God. So to start off with, the military is a unique government institution that may, by law and necessity, make unique, comprehensive demands over individual service members that it couldn't make over any other free members of society. The demands that the government is empowered to make in the military can and often do impact service members' liberties, including their constitutionally protected religious liberty. Our nation has a history, though, of striving to protect and accommodate military religious liberty, a tradition which has broadly protected service members' ability to live their faiths, to be who they are. Thus, in keeping with the best of our traditions, our military has long been a place where citizens could, as the Army chaplain's motto goes, serve pro Deo et patria, for God and country. And that's what we're here to talk about today, broadening and strengthening our military's already excellent commitment to allowing service members to serve their God and their country. As I mentioned before, I'm with the Becket Fund. The Becket Fund is the only organization, only law firm in the country that is devoted wholly to protecting religious liberty for people of every background, of every faith group, and making sure that the government doesn't coerce them into violating their faith. And so it is our honor, our privilege to be here with the Major and Amandeep and the rest to talk about why the Sikh community should be able to participate fully in American life. And let's step first into the history of military religious liberty. We go all the way back to the beginning, in fact, before the beginning, because before our country was founded, we had a chaplaincy. George Washington, during the French and Indian War, he recognized that something special was happening with the armed forces. They had religious faith groups that just a short time before had literally been at each other's throats, had literally been putting each other in jail and sometimes beating and killing one another. Instead, they were serving together. A quote from the time period talked about Massachusetts Congregationalists, Rhode Island Baptists, New York Episcopalians, and Dutch Reformed, New Jersey Presbyterians, Pennsylvania members of small Protestant sects, Maryland Roman Catholics, and a scattering of Jews, all working together. Again, faith groups that just across the pond were still killing each other, were working together in the military. And so General Washington recognized this, actually Colonel Washington at the time, and said, we need to protect religious liberty for all these different faith groups. And so what he did is he requested that the Virginia House of Delegates would create a chaplaincy program that would provide not only for the state church, because at that time Virginia had a state-sanctioned church, an established church, the Anglican Church, but for all other religious communities as well. So at the same time that the state of Virginia was actually imprisoning Baptist preachers for preaching without a license, it was also commissioning Baptist chaplains to protect the religious liberties of their Baptist service members. Our founders learned about religious liberty, learned about the value of religious liberty as they fought alongside people of different religious backgrounds. And later in the Continental Army, Washington, then General Washington, showed his solicitude again for faith-specific religious needs by seeking to give every regiment an opportunity to have a chaplain of their own religious sentiments. So from the very beginning, indeed, this is before the founding of the country, before we have the commitments in our First Amendment, President Washington and the military was already recognizing the crucial need to protect religious liberty. And that's continued throughout our history. In fact, there's a very compelling story of the four chaplains during World War I. And is about a Methodist, Jewish, Presbyterian, Catholic chaplain. And I know that sounds like the beginning of a joke, but in fact, these four chaplains were on a troop transport, an army troop transport, going to serve in Europe. And they were hit. They were hit by a U-boat, and it started to go down. The chaplains gave their life preservers to all the other service members in the boat, and then linked arms and sang hymns together, 4 different faith groups, sang hymns together as the boat went under the Atlantic Ocean and they all died together. So it's that kind of exemplary commitment to religious pluralism and commitment to protecting religious liberty that has just been it's been a part of the DNA of what it means to be a service member. Courts have recognized that this DNA is actually a part of the constitutional command, how our government has to treat service members. That's why, in fact, we have a chaplaincy at all. The U.S. Supreme Court recognized that the chaplaincy is the means by which our government accommodates religious practice by members of the military. And the Second Circuit recognized that unless the military had a chaplaincy, it would be both violating the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. Because the military can take service members, like the Major, and send them to far-flung places all around the world all the time, and put them in places where they can't fully exercise their religious liberty. And so the military has a duty to create a chaplain corps so to the best that they can support people like the Major, when he's doing the work that the military has called him to do. And Army regulations reflect this. The American Chaplaincy Corps represents the, quote, unique commitment of the American social and religious culture that values freedom of conscience and spiritual choice. Again, the Army regulations recognize that the free exercise rights of religion are a constitutional principle deeply embedded in the statutory foundations of the Army. So this goes all the way down to the bottom. Religious liberty is a part of what our military is. And that history continues to this day. In late 2011, the Army Chief of Chaplains allowed a bearded rabbi to become a chaplain. And he didn't have to shave his beard to serve his country. He was able to do both. And the Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty lauded the Army Chief of Chaplains for making that crucial choice. And just last year, President Obama awarded the posthumously awarded the Catholic priest, Emil Kapaun, the Medal of Honor for his service in the Korean War, where he served service members who were dying, who were being shot, who were wounded, pulled them to safety. He went to concentration camps, stayed in the concentration camp. He was given the choice to escape when the enemy was closing in. He stayed so he could meet the religious needs of the service members he was there with. Not all of them were Roman Catholic, but he wanted to stay so he could serve them as best he could. And he was killed in that concentration camp because he did an Easter sunrise service, because he was so committed to protecting the religious liberties of the people, even in a concentration camp. Again, this goes all the way to the DNA of what it means to be a service member. They are committed to protecting, committed to advancing as much as possible religious liberty in the military. So what are the benefits? Why is it so important? And this gets to our second point, the benefits of military religious liberty. First of all, it's a force multiplier. There's a famous Army Ranger, a guy by the name of Jeff Struker, and he was the Army Ranger of the Year and served in the Black Hawk Down conflict in Mogadishu. You could watch the movie, his character's in there. He also served in Panama, he served in the First Iraq, Second Iraq, and Afghanistan wars. And he got to a point, it was actually during the Black Hawk Down incident, where his entire command had been wiped out. He had to go into the Humvee and pull out dead bodies and then clean out the blood because they were told they were going back in. If they left the blood in, it'd be hard for the other Rangers to come back and help him go do the job that he needed to do. And he was terrified. I listened to him tell the story afterwards. He said, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to go back. And this is, before the situation arose, he'd already won the Army Ranger of the Year. So this was a brave, impressive individual. But he was terrified. And he said the thing that allowed him to turn around and go back and do the thing that he needed to do was his faith. Because it gave him confidence about what was ahead of him, about what was holding him, and about that no matter what happened, it would be okay. And that's why, after the incident in Mogadishu, he became an Army chaplain and served for 10 more years, encouraging other people's faith so they could do this incredibly important work. So for him, he would not have been able to do the job if he didn't have his faith, if he didn't have the ability to fully rely on his God to carry him through the incredibly difficult task that he was asked to do. And Army regulations, again, recognize this. The Department of Defense Instruction 1300.17, paragraph 4 says that Department of Defense places a high value on the rights of members of the military services to observe the tenets of their respective religion. And the Army regulations, they say the religious, moral, and spiritual health of the unit has been valued throughout the history of the Army. And it points out, just practically speaking, in many nations of the world, religious beliefs influence perceptions of power, diplomacy, law, and social customs. So by having a diverse military, a broadly diverse military, you are better able to go into different cultures, especially right now when we're in so many different cultures, and interact in a successful way, in an effective manner, because we have that diversity here at home. And we already have one of the most diverse militaries, if not the most diverse military in the world. But the bottom line, the most important reason why there's a benefit to us and there's a reason why we should be supporting military religious liberty is because it's right. More than any other class of Americans, service members risk their lives to protect our rights. And we should be willing to ensure they do not lose the rights that they protect for us. The very life and death nature of military work means that religion takes on a particular importance for service members. Religious service members need the moral resources that religion provides to help guide taking, sacrificing, and protecting human life. And they need the assurance of religion to help face the loss of their own lives and that of their compatriots. This is real stuff. The Major saw people die. He protected people from dying. They need those kinds of resources to do the incredibly difficult job that they have done, and they're being asked to do all the time. So we're not writing on a blank slate. We've got this history, great history. We've got very clear commands and directives, reasons why we protect religious liberty. What about the statutes? What about the law? What about the Constitution? How do they apply? That's what we'll talk about finally. Now, one of the things that I want to, before we jump into that particular part, I just really want to commend the Sikh Coalition and the way they've gone about this. Because the military is a very honor-bound, very tradition-bound system. And if you just go in and say, military, you just need to change. You just need to do it the way I think you should do it. It's not going to work very well. But they've gone about it in a very respectful manner. They've submitted their requests to the military. I've read the types of things that they submitted to the military, outlining things very clearly. And they're not coming in and saying, this is the way it's got to be. They're saying, this is the way we like it to be, and we're doing our very best to accommodate ourselves to the military mission. And this is why we think we can do that. And they've laid it out there for the military, and they've done it exactly right. And so when I'm talking here about these regulatory and statutory and constitutional provisions that provide rights to members like the Major to exercise their religion, litigation is a possibility one day down the road, but that's not the way they've pursued this. That's not what this is about. This is instead about the types of guidance that the military should be looking at and making their own decisions about letting in more members and letting in all members of the Sikh community. Okay. So the most important statute that we can talk about here is RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that applies, first of all, is a federal statute that applies to the federal government. And so that includes the military. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says really two things. One, if you have a sincere religious belief, the government can't substantially burden it without, two, showing that it has a very good reason for doing it, and then that is only doing, the burden is absolutely necessary to reach that particular reason. So an example that you would see for something like this is, why would you burden the religious beliefs of a particular religious group that doesn't believe that people should get medical service, for instance, blood transfusion? Well, if a child's life is in danger, you can say, well, the government has a compelling interest protecting the life of the child. The only way they can protect the life of this particular child in this particular illness is by giving them that blood transfusion. And so in this particular situation, the government can override the substantial burden on the religious belief to protect the life of the child. So that's kind of how it works in a situation where where RFRA is implicated, but it doesn't stop the particular government action in question. So let's look at how this statutory framework would apply in this context, where a Sikh was trying to participate in the life of the military. First, is it a sincere religious belief? This one's very, very easy. Obviously it is. We're talking about a tradition that's hundreds of years old that we can see evidenced worldwide. It's not like the religion of the flying spaghetti monster, where people are making things up. And literally, there's folks who are making up the flying spaghetti monster. I think they have a thing down in Florida right now. It would be Florida, wouldn't it? No, nothing in. Yeah. It's not anything like that. It's not an insincere thing that's being made up for some sort of political gain or anything like that. It's very sincere. And just think about it. How many people do you see walking around wearing turbans all day long? If you had the choice, would you wear a turban or not wear a turban? For most Americans, the answer is a pretty clear one. The easier thing to do is look like everyone else. The hard thing to do is live according to your religious beliefs. So this isn't a situation where people are just trying to get ahead, trying to not have to shave and be in the military at the same time. This is a sincere religious belief. Second question, is there a substantial burden? Is being kicked out of the military a substantial burden on your religious beliefs? And the answer there is a pretty clear yes. In fact, just this past year, in November, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that it was a substantial burden on an IRS employee's exercise of her Sikh faith to be fired from her position because she wasn't allowed to wear her articles of faith. So that choice between your job or your faith, courts have found, is a substantial burden. In fact, courts have found things as minor as a $5 fine in the Yoder case, Wisconsin v. Yoder, where the parents were told that they had to send their kids to school. The Amish parents didn't want to have to do that, and they were being fined $5 for not doing it. The court found that was a substantial burden on their faith. So again, fairly clearly, we see that the military choosing to kick Sikh service members out of the service would be a substantial burden on their faith. So that takes us to the next level. Okay, so we remember RFRA does two things: sincere religious belief, substantial burden. Second part is you have to have a really good reason, and you have to be very narrowly tailored to that reason. You've got to do it this way, and this is the only way to do what you need to do. This test is called strict scrutiny, and it's the most stringent test known to constitutional law. The tag phrase that you hear in law school is it's strict in theory and fatal in fact. Basically, if you're facing strict scrutiny, generally speaking, you lose. And that's probably what would be the case here as well. The compelling interest, the government's really, really important reason under RFRA, it's not just a broad important reason, like we need to be able to keep this rule so that if 10,000 people came and did this exact same thing, we'd have a problem. They have to show why the major is somehow violating a compelling interest by wearing his articles of faith. It has to be narrowly tailored to his situation. They have to address his specific situation. And as you heard earlier, most of the objections that have been raised to wearing the articles of faith have already been addressed. And so the military's interests aren't being harmed there. So they probably have a hard time showing the compelling interest test, especially under the requirement they have to show it to the person. And this becomes even harder when you consider the military does make some limited exceptions already, for instance, for beards. So special forces are allowed to wear beards. I got this from my brother who was in Afghanistan, who was serving with special forces, and said, oh yeah, things get a little crazy over there. Beards do happen. And they also allow them for medical reasons. They, so there's certain skin conditions that make it very difficult to shave regularly or shave at all. And so the military does allow special accommodations for medical reasons to have a beard. Well, there was a very, very, very similar case out of New Jersey with then Judge Samuel Alito. That was exactly this kind of situation where the police said, well, we're not going to allow Muslims to be on the police force because they want to have long beards and we can't allow that. But we do make exceptions for our undercover cops and for people who have a medical condition that makes it so they can't shave. Well, Judge Alito looked at it, went the rest of the Third Circuit, they looked at it and said, no, that's not going to work. Because you say you have a compelling interest here in keeping these Muslim service members off, but you're letting other people in. Now, for the undercover cops, they said that's fine, because the interest the government said they had there, the police said they had there, was in uniformity. And obviously, undercover cops not in uniform. And so probably for the same reason, special forces wouldn't be an undermining factor here, because oftentimes they are working in the host communities, oftentimes dressing. They're not in uniform so that they can better train in the host communities, and sometimes they are in fact going undercover. So that wouldn't necessarily undermine the government's interest. But the medical accommodation is exactly the same in both the Fraternal Order of Police case and this situation here. And so the question comes down is, why is it more important to allow a medical exemption than allow a religious exemption? And the answer is, it's not. It's just not a good enough reason. And that's what the court said, and there's a very good chance that's what courts would say if they were looking at this same situation. And finally, the narrow tailoring prong. This is the last thing that says you really have to be, this is the only way to accomplish that very, very important interest that you're trying to protect. And with that, you have to show that there are no available alternatives to reach the goal that you're trying to reach. And again, that's going to be very difficult here, especially because of the existing exemptions that already are there. There's some other regulations and some other considerations that come in here, but I've already gone over, so I'm going to stop. And we can talk about those afterwards.
Is the wearing of the turban. As Rajdeep framed, the current policy of the Department of Defense and each of the branches in our U.S. Armed Forces is one that presumptively excludes members of the Sikh faith as well as other religious minorities where they have obvious articles of faith that conflict with military-issued headwear or other uniform requirements, and then a tacit ban on facial hair. And I'll get into some of the rationales and concerns that appear to drive those two policies. But what I wanted to do initially is just give you a sense of the deep and rich military history of Sikhs serving both around the world as well as here in the United States. Sikhs have served, as you can imagine, in the Indian Armed Forces, where the Sikh community originates, and are an integral part of that armed forces. The current chief of the Indian Army is a Sikh and wears a turban, keeps a beard. In the United Kingdom and the forces of the UK, in the Canadian forces, and as UN peacekeepers. There are also a spattering of Sikh soldiers and other armed forces around the world. But more importantly, Sikhs have a long history of serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, in particular in the U.S. Army. As early as World War I, Becket Singh thinned
inspiration for me, and a wonderful bit of feedback to hear. But later in life, I was disappointed to learn, as many of us in the Sikh community were also disappointed to learn, that Sikh Americans are presumptively prohibited from serving in the U.S. Armed Forces on account of their religion. So that's the context of this discussion today. And what I'd like to do before I introduce the panelists is sort of walk you through some of the materials that you may have on your chairs and which are available outside. Underneath our cover page, you will find a Dear Colleague letter, which is circulating in the House as we speak. This Dear Colleague letter, in general terms, expresses support for religious liberty for Sikh Americans who wish to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And before I introduce the panelists, I want to ask whether we've got representatives here from the offices who are sponsoring this letter, namely the offices of Congressman David Valadao, Congressman Joseph Crowley, Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen, and Congresswoman Judy Chu. I see Jessica here, I see Jeremy here. Is Steve here? Is anyone from Amit from Congresswoman Chu's office? Well, we've got representatives here from these offices who are sponsoring this letter. So if at any point during this presentation you have questions about the letter or after this presentation, please be in touch with these folks. We'd love to have your offices endorse this letter after this briefing. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists very quickly. And by the way, there are people in the back. I invite you to take some seats up front here. I want to introduce our panelists, and then we'll begin very quickly. Kamaljeet Singh is a partner at the law firm McDermott, Will, and Emery. It's a major international law firm. He focuses on complex commercial litigation. He also has the distinction of being a co-founder of the Sikh Coalition and has been recognized for his work, his pro bono work in support of religious liberty for the Sikh community in the last several years after the formation of the Sikh Coalition. He's been instrumental, his firm's been instrumental in helping move our campaign forward with respect to Sikhs in the U.S. Armed Forces. To his right, we have Major Kamaljeet Singh Kalsi. Major Kamaljeet Singh Kalsi is a veteran of our nation's war in Afghanistan. He is a physician, he's a medical doctor, but he's also a proud American soldier. He made history in 2009 by receiving a very rare individualized waiver to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces with his Articles of Faith intact. And he's very modest about this, but he came back from Afghanistan with a Bronze Star Medal for his service in our nation's military. And then finally, we have Daniel Blomberg. Daniel Blomberg is legal counsel for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. The Becket Fund, if any of you are not aware, is one of the premier law firms devoted to protecting and vindicating religious liberty in the United States. They've successfully litigated a number of cases implicating religious liberty in the federal courts and also in the U.S. Supreme Court. Daniel, I believe, clerked for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, so he is a very sort of distinguished lawyer and litigator. So with that, I am happy to begin our briefing.
Just echoing on what Rajdeep just mentioned, thank you all so much for being here today. I know you have busy schedules and catching up after the holidays, and we were really excited to be on the Hill today. The information we're covering is the type of information we've been covering with individual offices, but to have the opportunity to not only speak to this group, but have Major Kalsi here with us, as well as Daniel from the Becket Fund, is really a unique opportunity, so we're glad you're here. In case it's not obvious from the intro from Rajdeep, I wanted to just cover sort of Sikhism 101. The uncut hair and turban are required religious articles of faith. So Sikh men, as a result of the requirement that we not cut our hair, also have uncut facial hair. And then an extension of that obligation, an extension of that uniform is
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. There are still people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Welcome. My name is Rajdeep Singh. I serve as Policy Director for the Sikh Coalition, which is the nation's largest Sikh American advocacy organization. We're very proud to be here today to present a briefing on barriers to religious liberty for Sikh Americans who wish to serve in the U.S. military. We're going to be hearing from a very distinguished group of panelists. But before I introduce them, I want to share an anecdote to ground us in some context. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I was into baseball cards when I was a kid. And when I was 9 years old, I remember on one occasion going to a baseball card store and walking up to the man who ran the store and asking to look at some baseball cards. And he saw me. He was kind of an elderly gentleman, and he said, "You're a Sikh, aren't you?" I said, "Sure." And remember, I was a kid. I was about 9 or 10 years old. He says, "You know what? I served with Sikh soldiers in Burma during World War II. Your people are great fighters. Your people are great soldiers. So I just want to recognize everything that your community has done for the Allies during the World Wars." As you can imagine, this was a